218 BC. The Roman Senate chamber fell silent as the messenger from Cisalpine Gaul finished his report. Carthaginian forces had been sighted descending from the Alpine passes, with elephants. The senators exchanged glances of disbelief. Hannibal Barca had done the impossible. He had marched an army including war elephants over mountains that Romans considered impassable barriers, mountains where even experienced Alpine tribes struggled to maintain trails during the best weather. The strategic assumptions upon which Rome had built its entire defensive strategy had just shattered like pottery dropped on marble. The Second Punic War had begun 6 months earlier, when Hannibal's forces besieged Saguntum, a Roman ally in Hispania. Rome's response had been predictable and methodical. They would send one army to Hispania to engage Hannibal directly, another to Africa to threaten Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to abandon his Spanish campaign and return home. The strategy had worked before. Roman military doctrine relied on superior organization, discipline, and the geographic advantages of controlling the Italian peninsula. The Alps were considered Rome's northern wall, a natural fortification that required minimal garrison. No significant army had ever crossed them. No one had even attempted it with elephants. Hannibal Barca, at 29 years old, understood something that Roman strategists had forgotten. Psychological warfare was as important as tactical superiority. His father, Hamilcar Barca, had made young Hannibal swear an oath at age 9, eternal hatred of Rome. For 2 decades, Hannibal had prepared for this moment, studying Roman military history, training in both Carthaginian and Spanish warfare techniques, and learning the one lesson his father had taught above all others. Rome's strength was also its weakness. Roman generals followed doctrine. They expected enemies to behave rationally, to make decisions based on conventional military wisdom. Hannibal's entire strategy rested on doing the impossible, forcing Rome to fight on his terms in their own homeland. The march from New Carthage in Hispania to the Alps covered over 1,000 miles through hostile territory. Hannibal departed in late May 218 BC with approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The elephants alone represented a logistical nightmare that would have deterred any conventional commander. These were not the massive African bush elephants of popular imagination, but a now extinct subspecies of North African forest elephants, smaller than their bush cousins but still standing 8 to 9 feet at the shoulder and weighing 4 to 5 tons each. Each elephant required 300 pounds of food daily, nearly 150 gallons of water, and specialized handlers called mahouts who had trained with these specific animals for years. The Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the future Scipio Africanus, commanded the army designated for Hispania. His strategy was straightforward: intercept Hannibal's forces as they moved along the Mediterranean coast, defeat them in conventional battle, and end the campaign before it truly began. Scipio landed at Massilia, modern Marseille, in September, expecting to catch Hannibal's army as it crossed the Rhone River. Roman scouts reported Carthaginian forces approaching the river near modern Avignon. Scipio's intelligence estimates suggested Hannibal had perhaps 50,000 troops remaining after fighting through hostile Gallic tribes in southern France. The consul prepared for a decisive engagement that would cement his reputation and end this upstart Carthaginian's ambitions. What happened at the Rhone crossing revealed the genius that would terrorize Rome for the next 15 years. Hannibal knew Roman forces were approaching. Any conventional general would have either retreated to defensive positions or rushed the crossing, accepting heavy casualties. Hannibal did neither. He sent a detachment of Spanish cavalry and Numidian light infantry 25 miles upriver, with orders to cross unseen and attack the Roman positions from behind, while his main force constructed an elaborate river-crossing operation that appeared vulnerable to Roman attack. The Carthaginians built rafts, collected boats from local Gallic tribes, and began the process of moving 38,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants across a river 200 yards wide with strong current. The elephant crossing became legendary even among Hannibal's enemies. The mahouts constructed massive rafts covered with earth and vegetation, making them appear like extensions of the riverbank. The lead elephants, followed by females with calves, walked onto these disguised rafts, only realizing they were waterborne when handlers cut the tethers and began towing them across. Some elephants panicked, overturning their rafts and plunging into the river. Witnesses on both sides watched in amazement as these enormous creatures swam across the Rhone, using their trunks as snorkels, their mahouts clinging to their ears and necks. Not a single elephant drowned, though several rafts were lost and various supplies ended up scattered along the riverbank. Scipio arrived with his vanguard just as the last Carthaginian units reached the far bank. He prepared to attack across the river when his own positions came under assault from the Spanish and Numidian detachment Hannibal had sent upriver days earlier. The Romans found themselves caught between two forces, unable to prevent the crossing and forced into defensive positions. Scipio withdrew to Massilia, sent urgent dispatches to Rome warning that Hannibal was heading not south into Hispania as expected, but north toward the Alps. The Senate's response was dismissive. No army could cross the Alps, especially not with elephants. Scipio was ordered to continue to Hispania as planned. His son, the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later earn the name Africanus, remained with the army and learned his first lesson in fighting Hannibal Barca, expect the impossible. Hannibal's choice of Alpine route remains debated by historians to this day. Ancient sources, primarily Polybius and Livy, provide different details that don't perfectly align with any single modern pass. The most likely routes are either the Col de Clapier or the Col de la Traversette, both exceeding 9,000 feet elevation and presenting challenges that would test even modern mountaineers. Hannibal chose his route based on intelligence from Gallic guides who promised relatively safe passage and friendly tribes on the Italian side. What those guides failed to mention, or perhaps didn't know, was that October in the Alps meant early winter conditions, unpredictable storms and ice-covered trails barely wide enough for single-file passage. The Carthaginian army entered the Alpine foothills in late October 216 BC. Polybius, writing decades later with access to eyewitness accounts, described the initial ascent as deceptively easy. The lower valleys were inhabited by Celtic tribes, some friendly, others hostile but manageable. The army moved through areas with established trails, crossing rivers on existing bridges, purchasing supplies from local settlements. Then they reached the higher elevations where the trails narrowed to paths, where bridges gave way to river fords, where friendly villages disappeared, and the only inhabitants were mountain tribes who viewed the approaching army as an opportunity for plunder. The first major crisis came at a narrow gorge where hostile mountain tribesmen had blocked the trail with boulders and positioned themselves on the heights above, ready to rain rocks and spears on the passing army. Hannibal faced an impossible tactical situation. The gorge was the only route forward. Turning back meant abandoning the entire campaign. Forcing through meant casualties his army couldn't afford. His solution demonstrated the calculated ruthlessness that characterized his entire campaign. He sent his cavalry and Spanish infantry, his most expendable troops, through first, accepting heavy losses as they cleared the blockade. Then he positioned his African veterans, his best troops, to hold the defile while the rest of the army passed. The elephants, too large to take cover and too valuable to risk in the initial assault, were held back until the route was secured. The mountain tribes, never having seen elephants, panicked when these enormous beasts finally entered the gorge. Warriors who had held firm against trained infantry fled at the sight and sound of animals that trumpeted challenges echoing off the canyon walls. But the gorge took its toll. Estimates suggest 2,000 men died in the fighting and aftermath, and several elephants were injured by rockfalls. Worse was the psychological impact. The soldiers, mostly from Mediterranean climates, found themselves in an alien environment where the air was thin, the cold penetrated wool and leather, and the trails were barely wide enough for men, much less elephants and baggage trains. As the army climbed higher, October gave way to November and the first serious snowstorms hit. Polybius describes soldiers waking to find their tents collapsed under snow, their water frozen solid, their pack animals dead from exposure. The trails, already treacherous, became ice-covered death traps, where a single misstep meant a fall of hundreds of feet. Men who had fought fearlessly against Roman legions wept in terror as they inched along cliff faces with infinite drops on one side and sheer rock on the other. The elephants, with their wide feet and immense weight, struggled on ice-covered trails designed for mountain goats. Mahouts had to wrap their feet in cloth, creating crude traction devices, and guide them step by careful step. The descent into Italy proved worse than the ascent, Fresh snow had covered old ice, creating a treacherous surface where men and animals slipped and fell. A rockfall, possibly triggered by an earthquake or simply the passage of thousands of men and animals, blocked the main trail. Hannibal's engineers discovered the rock was too massive to move and too solid to break with the tools available. They were trapped on a mountain trail with winter closing in, supplies running low, and no way forward. The solution entered military legend, though modern historians debate whether it actually occurred as described. Hannibal ordered his men to cut down trees, build enormous bonfires around and on top of the blocking rocks, then douse the heated stone with wine, the only liquid available that hadn't frozen. The thermal shock caused the rock to fracture. Whether through this method or more conventional engineering, the Carthaginians cleared the obstacle and continued their descent. 15 days after entering the high Alps, Hannibal's army emerged into the Po Valley of northern Italy. The force that had departed Hispania with 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry now numbered approximately 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. The elephants, incredibly, numbered 37 still, though many were injured, frostbitten, or sick. The humans were in worse condition. Frostbite cases numbered in the thousands. Men had lost fingers, toes, even entire feet to the cold. Equipment was damaged or lost. The army's supplies were nearly exhausted, and morale hung by a thread. Any rational assessment would have concluded that Hannibal's force was combat ineffective, that Rome faced not a threat but a defeated army that had destroyed itself, accomplishing an impossible feat. The assessment would have been catastrophically wrong. Hannibal understood that the psychological impact of his arrival outweighed any tactical weakness. He had done what Romans believed impossible. He had brought war to Italy itself, something that hadn't happened since Pyrrhus of Epirus 60 years earlier. The Gallic tribes of the Po Valley, recently conquered by Rome and still resentful of Roman occupation, saw Hannibal not as a defeated force but as a liberator. Within weeks, his army swelled with Gallic warriors eager to strike at Rome. More importantly, the elephants had survived. These living siege engines, these creatures of legend, gave Hannibal's force a psychological weapon that transcended their actual tactical utility. News of Hannibal's arrival caused panic in Rome, unlike anything since the Gallic sack of the city 173 years earlier. The Senate had assumed the Alps would stop him. That assumption had been the foundation of Rome's entire strategic planning. With Hannibal in northern Italy, the war Rome had planned to fight in Hispania, and Africa would instead be fought in Italy, threatening Roman territory, Roman allies, and potentially Rome itself. Consul Sempronius Longus, who had been preparing to invade Africa, was immediately recalled with his legions. Praetor Lucius Manlius Vulso was ordered to take his army north to block Hannibal's advance. The machinery of Roman military mobilization, honed through centuries of constant warfare, began grinding into action. The first engagement came in late November 218 BC at a location near the Ticinus River, a tributary of the Po. This wasn't a major battle, but a cavalry skirmish between reconnaissance forces. The engagement was nonetheless significant because it demonstrated that Hannibal's cavalry, particularly his Numidian light horse, were vastly superior to Roman mounted forces. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the same consul who had failed to stop Hannibal at the Rhone, commanded the Roman forces. In the fighting, Scipio was severely wounded and nearly killed, saved only by his 17-year-old son, the future Africanus, who charged into the melee to rescue his father. The Romans withdrew, and importantly, many of Rome's Gallic allies defected to Hannibal after witnessing Roman vulnerability. The Battle of Trebia came in December 218 BC, and it revealed the full extent of Roman strategic problems. Sempronius Longus had arrived from Sicily with fresh legions and was eager to engage Hannibal before winter made campaigning impossible. Scipio, still recovering from his wounds, counselled caution. The army should wait, build strength, allow Hannibal's forces to suffer through winter in hostile territory. Sempronius disagreed. His consular term would expire in weeks. He wanted the glory of defeating Hannibal, and he believed Roman infantry superiority would overcome any Carthaginian advantages. The disagreement between the two consuls created exactly the situation Hannibal needed to exploit. Hannibal engineered the battle through a simple stratagem. On a freezing December morning, he sent Numidian cavalry to raid the Roman camp, harassing the pickets and withdrawing when Roman forces emerged. Sempronius, eager for battle, ordered his entire army, approximately 36,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, to pursue. The Romans had to wade through the ice-cold Trebia River without having eaten breakfast, emerging soaked and freezing on the far bank. Hannibal's army, well fed and rested, waited in battle formation with the elephants positioned on the flanks, and critically, 2,000 picked infantry and cavalry hidden in covered terrain under the command of Hannibal's brother Mago. The battle itself followed conventional patterns initially. Roman infantry in their standard formation, heavy infantry in the centre, lighter troops on the flanks, engaged Hannibal's line. The Romans, despite being cold, hungry and wet, were pushing back the Carthaginian centre through sheer disciplined ferocity. Then Hannibal's hidden force emerged from concealment and struck the Roman rear. Simultaneously, Hannibal's cavalry and elephants routed the Roman mounted forces and began rolling up the Roman flanks. The legions found themselves surrounded, attacked from all sides, unable to maintain formation. The elephants, in their first major battle since crossing the Alps, proved as much psychological weapons as tactical ones. Roman infantry, trained to face human opponents in structured combat, panicked when confronted with animals that stood taller than a man on horseback, that could crush soldiers beneath their feet or impale them with their tusks. The trumpeting of agitated elephants, the sound of their massive bodies smashing through shield walls, the sheer alien nature of these creatures created terror that undermined Roman discipline. Of the 36,000 Romans who entered battle, approximately 20,000 were killed or captured. Only the 10,000 Roman infantry in the centre, the best troops who maintained formation throughout, managed to cut their way through Carthaginian lines and escape. Trebia validated every impossible element of Hannibal's strategy. He had crossed the Alps, bringing elephants to Italy, and had destroyed a consular army in the first major engagement. The psychological impact reverberated throughout the Mediterranean world. Rome's Italian allies, the foundation of Roman military power, began questioning their allegiance. If Rome couldn't protect them from Hannibal, why remain loyal? The Senate's response was to double down, raising new legions, appointing new consuls for 217 BC, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius, and preparing for a campaign that would crush this Carthaginian upstart. Winter 218 to 217 BC proved devastating for Hannibal's elephants. Of the 37 that had crossed the Alps, only one would survive to continue the campaign. The combination of injuries sustained in the crossing, diseases contracted in the harsh conditions, and the unfamiliar Italian winter killed them one by one. Ancient sources suggest several died from infected wounds, others from what modern veterinarians would recognize as pneumonia or other respiratory diseases exacerbated by the altitude changes and extreme conditions. The single survivor, possibly Hannibal's personal mount called Surus, meaning the Syrian, became famous enough that ancient writers mentioned it specifically. The loss of the elephants removed Abeza's significant tactical advantage, but their psychological impact remained. Rome and its allies knew Hannibal had brought elephants over the Alps, and that knowledge alone suggested capabilities beyond normal human achievement. The spring campaign of 217 BC demonstrated that Hannibal didn't need elephants to terrorize Rome. His army, reinforced by Gallic allies and recovering from winter, marched south towards central Italy. Consul Gaius Flaminius positioned his army to block Hannibal's advance at Arretium, modern Arezzo, confident that he could stop the Carthaginians in open battle. Hannibal instead bypassed the Roman position entirely, marching his army through supposedly impassable marshes to emerge behind Flaminius and threatening Rome's direct communication lines. The marsh crossing itself was another impossible feat that enhanced Hannibal's reputation. His troops marched for 4 days through fetid swamps, where men and horses sank to their knees, where sleep was impossible without drowning, where disease spread rapidly. Hannibal himself lost the sight in one eye to an infection contracted in the marshes, but the strategic advantage gained was worth any cost. Flaminius, humiliated by being outmaneuvered and desperate to protect his reputation, pursued Hannibal's army without waiting for his co-consul Servilius to join forces. This played perfectly into Hannibal's strategy. The Carthaginian army moved along the shore of Lake Trasimene, apparently vulnerable, obviously aware of Roman pursuit but seeming unable or unwilling to turn and fight. Flaminius, eager to catch and destroy this foreign invader, pushed his legions to forced march, stringing them out along the narrow road between the lake and steep hills. On the morning of June 21st, 217 BC, as morning fog obscured visibility, Flaminius's lead elements entered a natural defile created by the hills closing toward the lake. Hannibal's entire army, concealed on the hills above, waited in perfect silence. The Battle of Lake Trasimene was less a battle than an ambush on a massive scale. When the entire Roman column, approximately 25,000 men, had entered the killing zone, Hannibal's forces attacked simultaneously from the hills, driving the Romans toward the lake with nowhere to retreat. The fog that had concealed the Carthaginian positions now prevented Romans from seeing the scope of the disaster, from organising any coherent response, from even understanding what was happening. Cohorts found themselves surrounded and destroyed without ever seeing the main Roman formation. Flaminius, trying desperately to rally his troops, was killed in the first hour of fighting, reportedly by a Gallic warrior named Eucharius, who had sworn revenge for earlier Roman actions in Gaul. The massacre lasted 3 hours. Of the 25,000 Romans in Flaminius's army, approximately 15,000 were killed outright, including the consul himself. Another 10,000 were captured. Hannibal's losses were minimal, perhaps 500 killed, mostly Gauls in the vanguard. More importantly, 4,000 Roman cavalry who had been serving as advance guard were intercepted and forced to surrender the day after the main battle. Rome had lost 2 consular armies in 2 major engagements. The strategy of confronting Hannibal directly in open battle had failed catastrophically twice. Something had to change. The Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, a temporary position with extraordinary powers used only in extreme emergencies. Fabius understood what his predecessors had not. Hannibal couldn't be defeated through conventional tactics. His army was too skilled, too experienced, and too well led. More critically, Hannibal's strategic situation was precarious despite his tactical successes. He controlled no ports for resupply from Carthage, no major cities for secure winter quarters, and his army, while successful in battle, couldn't sustain casualties indefinitely. Fabius implemented a strategy so radical it earned him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. He refused to engage Hannibal in open battle. Instead, Roman forces would shadow the Carthaginian army, attack foraging parties, intercept supplies, prevent Hannibal from recruiting allies, and essentially wait for the invaders to exhaust themselves. The Fabian strategy worked militarily, but was political poison in Rome. Romans were raised on legends of aggressive warfare, of virtues meaning courage in battle, of gloria earned through victory. Fabius's refusal to fight appeared cowardly to a population demanding vengeance for Trebia and Trasimene. When his dictatorship ended after 6 months, the Senate appointed new consuls for 216 BC with explicit instructions to bring Hannibal to battle and destroy him. Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro were given the largest army Rome had ever assembled, 8 full legions plus allied forces totaling approximately 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, twice the size of any previous consular army. Rome would end this threat through overwhelming force. The Battle of Cannae on August 2, 216 BC became the worst military disaster in Roman history and one of the most studied battles in all of military literature. Hannibal positioned his approximately 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry near the town of Cannae in Apulia, appearing vulnerable and outnumbered. The Romans, confident in their numerical superiority, deployed in their traditional formation but deeper than usual, creating a massive column of heavy infantry designed to smash through any opposition through sheer weight. What followed was a masterpiece of tactical planning that military academies still teach today. Hannibal deployed his forces in a shallow crescent with the weakest troops, Gauls and Spaniards, in the centre, and his best African infantry on the flanks, positioned slightly back. His cavalry, superior in quality if not quantity, occupied both wings. When the Romans advanced, their heavy infantry smashed into and began, pushing back Hannibal's centre exactly as he planned. The Carthaginian line bent backward, drawing more Romans into the trap. As the crescent inverted, Hannibal's African veterans wheeled inward, attacking the Roman flanks. Simultaneously, his cavalry defeated the Roman mounted forces and circled behind the Roman infantry, completing the encirclement. The Roman army, the largest force Rome had ever fielded, was now completely surrounded on all sides. What followed was systematic slaughter. Packed too tightly to use their weapons effectively, Unable to retreat or maneuver, the legions were cut down where they stood. The battle lasted all day. By evening, approximately 50,000 Romans were dead, including Consul Paulus, 2 quaestors, 29 of 48 military tribunes, and 80 senators who had volunteered to serve. Another 10,000 were captured. Hannibal's losses were approximately 6,000, mostly his Gallic troops who had borne the brunt of the initial Roman assault. It was the most complete tactical victory in ancient military history. The psychological impact of Cannae exceeded even the physical losses. Rome had sent its largest army ever assembled and had it virtually annihilated. Hannibal had crossed impossible mountains, survived impossible conditions, and now had destroyed 3 consular armies in 3 years. Allies across southern Italy defected to Carthage. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal. Macedonia's King Philip IV allied with Carthage against Rome. Syracuse in Sicily, previously a Roman ally, switched sides. The Roman Confederation that had taken 200 years to build appeared to be collapsing, yet Rome did not surrender. This response, or lack of response, was something Hannibal hadn't anticipated. After Cannae, he reportedly told his officers, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one," advice supposedly from his cavalry commander Hannibal, who urged an immediate march on Rome itself. Whether this conversation actually occurred is disputed, but the strategic problem was real. Hannibal lacked siege equipment to assault Rome's walls and insufficient forces to surround and blockade a city of 300,000 people. More critically, he had misunderstood the fundamental nature of Roman power. Rome's strength wasn't its armies, which Hannibal had repeatedly destroyed. It was the Roman system of confederation that bound Italian communities to Rome through a complex web of partial citizenship, shared military obligations, and mutual defence. Even after Cannae, most Italian allies remained loyal, not from love of Rome but from fear of their neighbours and recognition that Roman protection, however bloody and expensive, had provided stability. The Senate's response to Cannae demonstrated why this system worked. They ransomed back 8,000 Roman prisoners Hannibal held, then executed the commanders who had allowed themselves to be captured. The message was clear: loyalty to Rome was absolute, and defeat was not an excuse for surrender. Rome's strategic response to Hannibal's impossible feat of crossing the Alps was to make the impossible routine. They couldn't match Hannibal tactically. His 3 victories proved that. Instead, they would bury him under weight of numbers, of resources, of sheer stubborn refusal to quit. The Senate raised new legions from slaves, promising freedom for service. They lowered the minimum age for military service. They stripped temples of their gold and silver to fund the war. By 215 BC, Rome had 23 legions in the field, approximately 230,000 men under arms, the largest military force in Mediterranean history. Most importantly, they returned to Fabian tactics. No more open battles seeking glory, instead systematic strangulation, cutting Hannibal's supply lines, isolating his allies, making every mile of Italy hostile territory. For the next 13 years, Hannibal campaigned in Italy, winning tactical victories but unable to achieve strategic success. His brother Hasdrubal attempted to repeat Hannibal's feat, crossing the Alps with another army and elephants in 207 BC, but was intercepted and killed at the Battle of Metaurus before linking up with Hannibal. The defeat and Hasdrubal's death, his head thrown into Hannibal's camp as a message, marked the effective end of Carthaginian hopes in Italy. Without reinforcement, Hannibal's army was slowly ground down, not through defeat but through the endless attrition of a hostile land where every foraging party risked ambush, every ally could turn traitor, and every victory left him weaker while Rome simply raised more legions. The final act came in Africa. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young man who had saved his father at Ticinus, had spent years studying Hannibal's tactics. Appointed commander in Hispania, he had systematically conquered Carthaginian possessions there, then invaded Africa itself, threatening Carthage directly. The Carthaginian Senate, desperate, recalled Hannibal after 15 years in Italy. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC pitted the 2 great generals against each other for the only time. Scipio, using Hannibal's own tactical innovations, defeated him decisively. Carthage surrendered, and Rome became the dominant power in the Mediterranean. The elephants that appeared in the Alps lived in legend far beyond their tactical contribution. Only one survived the first winter, and even that animal's fate is uncertain after 216 BC. Yet their psychological impact persisted for generations. Romans told stories of Hannibal's elephants as proof that barriers they believed absolute could be overcome, that assumptions about what was possible could be shattered by will and genius. The elephant became a symbol in Roman culture representing both the exotic terrors of the wider world and the persistent threat that Rome must always remain vigilant against. Modern historians debate various aspects of Hannibal's Alpine crossing, the exact route, the number of elephants that survived how long, even whether the whole episode has been exaggerated by ancient writers. But the strategic and psychological reality is undeniable. Hannibal did cross the Alps with elephants, did bring war to Italy when Romans believed it impossible, and did force Rome to rethink every assumption about their security. The crossing didn't win the war, Carthage lost ultimately, but it changed Rome forever. The republic that emerged from the Second Punic War was harder, more paranoid, more aggressive in eliminating potential threats before they materialized. The lesson of Hannibal's elephants in the Alps was that nothing was truly impossible, and therefore everything was potentially threatening. 50 years after Zama, Roman armies destroyed Carthage utterly, ploughing the ruins with salt in symbolic annihilation, though this detail is likely later invention. The destruction was justified by claims of Carthaginian violations of peace treaties, but the real reason was simpler. Rome had learned from Hannibal that a defeated enemy who survives can attempt the impossible. Better to ensure no possibility of repetition exists. The psychological scar left by elephants appearing where they could not possibly be had never healed. Rome had realized nothing was impossible, and that realization made them the most ruthlessly thorough conquerors the ancient world had ever seen. The paranoia that gripped Rome after Hannibal's crossing manifested in ways that shaped Western civilization for centuries. The Senate, traditionally cautious about foreign entanglements, began a program of preventive warfare that modern scholars call defensive imperialism. Any potential threat, no matter how distant, required military response before it could mature into another Hannibal. This logic drove Rome to conquer Macedonia in 200 BC, merely 2 years after Zama, because Philip III had allied with Carthage during Rome's darkest hours. The Seleucid Empire fell next, defeated at Magnesia in 190 BC, not because they threatened Rome directly, but because their king Antiochus III had offered Hannibal refuge and a command position after Zama. Hannibal himself became Rome's obsession. After Zama, he served as chief magistrate of Carthage, implementing reforms that restored Carthaginian finances so effectively that Rome demanded his extradition in 195 BC, claiming he was planning renewed war. Hannibal fled to the Seleucid court where he advised Antiochus on fighting Rome, designing a plan that included invading Italy, naturally, though the Seleucid king ignored most of his advice. After Antiochus's defeat, Hannibal fled again, eventually taking refuge with King Prusias of Bithynia. When Roman ambassadors demanded his surrender in 193 BC, Hannibal, then approximately 64 years old, chose suicide by poison rather than Roman captivity. His last reported words were a bitter commentary on Roman persistence and fear. Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. The military innovations forced upon Rome by Hannibal's campaigns transformed the legion from a citizen militia into a professional fighting force. Before Hannibal, Roman armies disbanded after each campaign season, with farmers returning to their fields. The need to maintain constant pressure on Hannibal for 15 years created the first long-term professional Roman soldiers. Gaius Marius would formalize these changes a century later, but the foundation was laid in the desperate years after the elephants appeared in the Alps. Roman military doctrine absorbed Hannibal's tactical lessons. The rigid formations that had been slaughtered at Cannae gave way to more flexible manipular tactics. Roman cavalry, exposed as inferior at Trebia and Cannae, was reformed and supplemented with auxiliary forces from conquered peoples who brought specialized skills. The psychological impact on individual Roman soldiers who fought against Hannibal persisted throughout their lives. Veterans of Cannae who survived and were eventually ransomed or escaped carried a trauma that Roman society struggled to process. Many were formed into punishment legions and sent to Sicily, considered too unreliable for mainland service because they had experienced Roman military invincibility shattered. These men had stood in formation and watched their army destroyed around them, had seen tactical genius turn Roman numerical superiority into a killing box. Some became instructors, teaching new recruits hard lessons about hubris and the dangers of underestimating enemies. Others became the nucleus of a permanent professional military class, men who had no other trade after years of continuous warfare. The economic consequences of Hannibal's campaign reshaped Roman society in ways contemporaries barely understood. The Second Punic War cost Rome approximately 400,000 military casualties over 17 years, devastating the small farmer class that formed the backbone of the Roman military and agricultural system. With men dead or away fighting for years, farms fell into neglect. Large landholders, primarily senators and equestrians with capital reserves, bought up failed farms, creating the latifundia plantation system worked by the massive influx of slaves captured in Rome's expanding conquests. This concentration of agricultural wealth would destabilize the Republic within a century, creating the landless urban mob and desperate veterans whose grievances demagogues like the Gracchi brothers and eventually Julius Caesar would exploit. The elephants themselves became objects of Roman fascination bordering on obsession. Whenever Rome conquered territories where war elephants existed, they made point of capturing and displaying them in triumphal processions. Scipio Africanus paraded 4 elephants in his triumph after defeating Hannibal at Zama. Lucius Cornelius Sulla displayed 18 elephants captured from King Jugurtha of Numidius in 106 BC. Pompey the Great attempted to parade 20 African elephants through Rome's city gates in 81 BC, but had to abandon the plan when the elephants wouldn't fit through the opening, a humiliation that ancient writers recorded with obvious satisfaction. The message was always the same: Rome had mastered the impossible, conquered the creatures that had once terrified them, turned Hannibal's psychological weapons into symbols of Roman dominance. The Romans never truly understood why Hannibal's elephants had succeeded psychologically where subsequent elephants failed. Modern analysis suggests the answer lies in context and expectation. When elephants appeared in the Alps and at Trebia, Romans confronted not just unfamiliar animals, but the shattering of geographical assumptions they had considered absolute. Later Roman soldiers knew elephants existed, had heard veterans describe them, understood they could be killed with pilum javelins or by cutting their hamstrings. Familiarity bred not contempt exactly, but reduced terror to manageable fear. The first encounter with the impossible carries psychological weight that subsequent encounters cannot replicate. The engineering challenges of Hannibal's crossing became legendary among Roman military engineers. How exactly had he moved 37 elephants over terrain where experienced Alpine guides struggled? Ancient sources provide fragments that modern researchers combine with experimental archaeology to reconstruct possibilities. The trail widening alone represented enormous labour. Alpine passes followed natural features, valleys and ridges, but these natural routes were often too narrow for elephant passage. Carthaginian engineers had to widen trails, which meant moving rock in freezing conditions at altitude with Bronze Age tools. The heating rock with fire and cooling it with wine to create thermal fractures, as described for clearing the rockfall, may have been used throughout the crossing wherever solid stone blocked elephant passage. The logistics of feeding 37 elephants during a 15-day mountain crossing staggers modern understanding. Each elephant required approximately 300 pounds of food daily, totaling 11,250 pounds of fodder per day for the entire elephant corps. Over 15 days, that amounts to 168,750 pounds, or 84 tons of elephant food. The army couldn't carry this weight, which means they relied on foraging in the Alps in October and November. What vegetation existed at those altitudes and season? Alpine grasses would have been dormant or dead. Tree bark and branches become elephant food in desperation, but contains limited nutrition. Most likely, Hannibal's advance parties scouted ahead specifically to locate areas where elephants could feed, extending the crossing timeline whenever necessary to allow the animals adequate foraging time. The veterinary care required to keep elephants alive through alpine conditions didn't exist in 218 BC in any formal sense. The mahouts, professional elephant handlers, from India and North Africa, possessed traditional knowledge passed through generations, but treating frostbite, altitude sickness, and injuries from falls on ice-covered trails exceeded their experience. The death of 36 of 37 elephants over the following months suggests cumulative damage from the crossing that even survival couldn't overcome. Frostbite would have affected feet first, the large surface area and constant contact with frozen ground, creating tissue damage that became infected. Respiratory problems from thin air and cold would have stressed cardiovascular systems already taxed by the physical exertion of mountain climbing. Any injuries, from rock falls or simply losing footing on treacherous trails, would have become infected in unsanitary conditions. The single elephant that survived possibly did so through pure chance, individual constitution, or because it received preferential care as Hannibal's personal mount. The Gallic guides who led Hannibal through the Alps have been largely forgotten by history, yet their contribution was indispensable. These men, whose names are lost, possessed generational knowledge of mountain routes of which passes remained traversable in late season, of where water sources existed, of how to read weather patterns in mountain environments. They likely warned Hannibal about the difficulties, the hostile tribes, the weather risks, and the general insanity of attempting an Alpine crossing in October with elephants. That Hannibal proceeded anyway speaks to either supreme confidence or calculated desperation. The strategic prize, surprising Rome by arriving in Italy from the impossible direction, outweighed the enormous risk of losing his army in the mountains. Roman attempts to replicate Hannibal's psychological victory by doing impossible things themselves became a pattern in subsequent centuries. Julius Caesar's bridge across the Rhine in 55 BC, constructed in just 10 days, was militarily unnecessary. The army crossed, spent 18 days demonstrating Roman presence to Germanic tribes, then returned to Gaul and dismantled the bridge. The point wasn't conquest, but demonstration. Romans could build bridges where none existed, could project power across natural barriers, could do things enemies considered impossible. Caesar explicitly referenced Hannibal in his memoirs when describing seemingly impossible engineering feats, understanding that psychological impact often exceeded tactical value. The Roman engineering corps that emerged in the centuries after Hannibal owed much to lessons learned from his campaigns. If enemies could cross impassable mountains, Romans needed to control and fortify those mountains. The Alpine passes became sites of Roman military roads, watchtowers, and fortifications. The Via Claudia Augusta, built under Emperor Claudius in 47 AD, ran from the Po Valley to the Danube, creating a reliable all-weather route through the Alps that eliminated the kind of strategic surprise Hannibal had achieved. The Romans built over 53,000 miles of paved roads throughout their empire, creating a transportation and communication network that made surprise attacks increasingly difficult. The roads were explicitly military infrastructure, designed to move legions quickly to threatened frontiers, to supply distant garrisons, to ensure no enemy could achieve what Hannibal had done and strike from an unexpected direction. The cultural memory of Hannibal's elephants persisted in Roman literature and art for centuries. Poets used them as metaphors for overcoming impossible obstacles. Virgil, writing the Aeneid under Augustus, referenced Hannibal's crossing as an example of human determination triumphing over nature's barriers. Livy, whose history of Rome dedicated books 21 through 30 to the Second Punic War, wrote with obvious admiration for Hannibal's audacity, even while maintaining proper Roman patriotic disgust for Rome's greatest enemy. The elder Pliny mentioned Hannibal's elephants in his natural history, speculating about their species and capabilities with the fascination of a naturalist encountering evidence of the exotic. The military training Roman soldiers received after Hannibal's campaigns included specific instruction on fighting elephants, even though Romans rarely encountered them after conquering Carthage's territories. The training became ritualized, a cultural memory of the trauma of Trebia and initial Alpine encounters. Soldiers learned to throw pilum javelins at the mahout, killing the controller rather than the elephant itself. They practiced holding formation against psychological pressure, understanding that elephants relied on panic to break organized infantry. Some sources mention training with elephant simulacra, wooden constructions covered with hides and manipulated by men inside, though whether this actually occurred or represents later elaboration is debated. The very existence of anti-elephant tactics in Roman military doctrine, maintained long after elephants ceased being battlefield threats, demonstrates the lasting psychological scar. The geopolitical consequences of Hannibal's crossing extended far beyond the immediate Second Punic War. Rome's determination to prevent any repetition drove them to eliminate not just Carthage, but any power capable of threatening Italy. The systematic conquest of the entire Mediterranean basin, transforming Rome from Italian power to Mediterranean hegemon, flowed directly from the security paranoia created by elephants appearing where they should not exist. Greece fell, despite having saved Western civilization from Persia, because Greek kingdoms might potentially threaten Rome. Egypt became a client state, and eventually a province, not because Egypt threatened Rome, but because Egypt's wealth could fund another Hannibal. The Roman Empire that dominated the Mediterranean for 500 years was built on foundations of fear, on determination that never again would Rome face existential threat from unexpected direction. The death of the last elephant from Hannibal's Alpine crossing, whenever and however it occurred, passed without recorded notice in ancient sources. No writer thought to mark the moment when Surus, or whichever animal survived longest, finally succumbed to accumulated injuries, disease, or simply age. This silence is itself significant. By the time the last elephant died, probably in 216 BC or shortly after, Rome had been forced to recognize that the animals themselves were not the true threat. Hannibal was the threat. His genius for logistics and tactics, his ability to inspire loyalty in diverse troops, his strategic vision that saw possibilities others missed. The elephants were symbols, powerful ones that achieved psychological effects beyond their tactical utility, but only symbols. Rome's focus shifted from the impossible feat of bringing elephants over the Alps to the more fundamental question of how to defeat the man who had conceived and executed that impossibility. The battle tactics developed to counter Hannibal became standard Roman doctrine. The emphasis on flexibility over rigid formation, on multiple lines that could rotate fresh troops into combat, on combined arms coordination between infantry and cavalry, all emerged from hard lessons learned against Carthaginian forces. Scipio Africanus, when he finally defeated Hannibal at Zama, employed modifications of Hannibal's own Cannae tactics, using superior Roman cavalry to envelope the Carthaginian army, while infantry held the centre. The student had learned from the master, and Rome's subsequent military successes owed much to incorporating and improving upon innovations originally used against them. The intelligence gathering and strategic planning improvements forced on Rome by Hannibal's surprise crossing created what modern analysts would recognize as an early intelligence apparatus. Roman embassies to foreign kingdoms began including military observers who assessed potential threats. Reports from provincial governors included detailed information about neighbouring peoples' military capabilities. The Senate maintained what amounted to threat assessment portfolios on every significant power within several months' travel of Roman territory. This institutional paranoia, born from the trauma of elephants in the Alps, made Rome increasingly proactive about eliminating potential threats before they matured. The transition from defensive republic to aggressive empire was psychologically enabled by the recognition that defense alone was insufficient when enemies could achieve the impossible. The Alpine crossing route itself became a pilgrimage site for Roman commanders seeking to understand Hannibal's achievement. Centuries later, officers stationed in Gaul or Cisalpine Gaul would visit the passes, stand where Carthaginian troops had stood, and attempt to comprehend the audacity required to lead an army through those mountains. Napoleon, 2,000 years later, studied Hannibal's crossing before his own Alpine campaign in 1800, understanding that psychological impact of appearing where enemies least expected could be as valuable as tactical superiority. The military lesson transcended ancient history, becoming part of strategic thinking about surprise, initiative, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. The economic exhaustion both sides experienced during the Second Punic War changed ancient Mediterranean economic systems. The massive military expenditures sustained for 17 years required financial innovations that persisted long after the war ended. Rome's practice of raising emergency revenues by taxing capital wealth, implemented during desperate years after Cannae, became precedent for later financial emergencies. The war debt Rome accumulated required decades to repay even with plunder from subsequent conquests. Carthage's economy never recovered from the financial strain of maintaining armies in Italy, Hispania, and defending Africa simultaneously. The war that began with elephants in the Alps ended with both participants economically devastated, though Rome possessed resources and manpower to recover while Carthage did not. The treatment of Carthaginian prisoners captured during Hannibal's campaigns revealed Roman vindictiveness born from trauma. Traditionally, Rome ransomed or exchanged prisoners according to established customs. After Cannae, the Senate refused to ransom 8,000 captured Romans, letting them die in Carthaginian custody rather than appear to reward defeat. Carthaginian prisoners received no such consideration. Many were sold as slaves, others executed publicly in triumphs. The normal rules of warfare, such as they existed in the ancient world, were suspended for enemies who had achieved the impossible and nearly destroyed Rome. This precedent for treating existential threats with absolute ruthlessness rather than traditional military honour would characterize Roman behaviour towards serious enemies for centuries. The religious response in Rome to Hannibal's successes included desperate appeals to gods and adoption of foreign religious practices thought to confer divine favour. After Trasimene, Romans consulted the Sibylline books, sacred texts supposedly containing prophecies and divine guidance. The books prescribed adoption of foreign cults and performance of archaic rituals fallen into disuse. Most dramatically, Rome adopted worship of Cybele, the great mother goddess from Asia Minor, specifically because oracles promised her favour would ensure Hannibal's defeat. The great black meteorite representing Cybele was brought to Rome in 204 BC with enormous ceremony, demonstrating the psychological depths to which Roman confidence had fallen. When traditional Roman gods apparently couldn't stop elephants in the Alps, foreign gods received desperate supplication. The agricultural devastation of Italy during Hannibal's campaigns created economic disruptions that persisted for generations. Hannibal's strategy after Cannae focused on ravaging the Italian countryside, destroying farms, burning crops, slaughtering livestock, making Roman territory economically unviable. Ancient estimates suggest 400 Italian towns were destroyed or severely damaged during the war. The Po Valley, where Hannibal first emerged from the Alps, suffered worst as armies from both sides repeatedly crossed the region, requisitioning supplies and destroying what they couldn't use to deny it to enemies. The recovery required decades and fundamentally changed Italian agriculture from small family farms to large slave-worked plantations, transforming Roman society's economic foundation. The psychological profile of Hannibal that Romans constructed after the war mixed grudging admiration with demonization. He was portrayed as brilliant but cruel, determined but faithless, courageous but barbarous. This complicated image served Roman needs for explaining how they had nearly lost to him, while maintaining their superiority narrative. Romans couldn't admit they had been simply outgeneraled by a better commander. That would undermine the ideology of Roman military excellence. Instead, Hannibal became a kind of monster, superhuman in capabilities but ultimately defeatable, because monstrous qualities included fatal flaws. The elephants fit perfectly into this narrative, symbols of exotic barbarism that briefly threatened civilization before Roman virtue triumphed. The veterans of Hannibal's army who survived the war and returned to Carthage, or scattered throughout the Mediterranean, carried their own traumatic memories. They had achieved impossible feats, crossed the Alps, defeated the legendary Roman legions repeatedly, survived 15 years of continuous combat far from home. Then they had lost, recalled to Africa for final defeat at Zama, watching their commander's strategic masterpiece unravel through lack of reinforcements and supplies, while Rome simply kept raising new legions. Many became mercenaries, hiring out to eastern kingdoms fighting Rome's expanding influence. Others disappeared into obscurity, broken men who had witnessed and participated in history but ended as footnotes. The Gallic warriors who had joined Hannibal, seeking freedom from Roman occupation, found themselves targets of savage Roman reprisals after Hannibal's eventual departure from Italy. The technical challenges of maintaining combat elephants in the field, revealed by the Alpine crossing casualties and subsequent losses, convinced most subsequent commanders that elephants weren't worth the logistical burden. The Seleucids continued using elephants, most famously at Magnesia, where 54 elephants fought against Rome in 190 BC, but increasing Roman familiarity reduced their psychological impact. The Battle of Thapsus in 46 BC featured 60 elephants, deployed by Numidian King Juba against Caesar's legions. The Roman soldiers, by then veterans of numerous campaigns including some with experience fighting elephants in Africa, actually laughed at the elephants and easily routed them. The wheel had turned completely. What once represented impossible terror had become almost comic, exotic curiosities rather than serious military threats. The moment when Rome truly overcame the psychological trauma of Hannibal's elephants came not on a battlefield, but in the arena. Romans began importing elephants for gladiatorial games, forcing them to fight each other or against exotic animals from conquered territories. Pompey's games in 55 BC featured 20 elephants fighting against Gaetulian hunters armed with javelins. The crowd reportedly reacted with sympathy when the elephants, wounded and terrified, tried to break out of the arena, calling down curses on Pompey for the cruelty. The sympathy itself demonstrated that elephants no longer represented existential threat. Romans could afford to pity elephants once they had thoroughly dominated the peoples who used them as weapons. The strategic lesson Rome learned from Hannibal's Alpine crossing was that geographical barriers provided security only against conventional thinking. Any barrier could be crossed, any defence circumvented, any assumption exploited by a sufficiently determined and creative enemy. This recognition transformed Roman grand strategy from defensive to aggressively expansionist. The best defence became pushing frontiers far from Italy, creating buffer zones of conquered territory where threats could be identified and neutralised before reaching critical proximity. The Roman Empire's eventual borders along the Rhine, Danube, and across North Africa represented this strategic philosophy made manifest defensive perimeters so distant from Rome that no enemy could replicate Hannibal's surprise appearance in Italy. The engineering knowledge required to move elephants through Alpine terrain, learned at terrible cost by Hannibal's army, was never systematically recorded or preserved. Each mahout possessed experiential knowledge about elephant behaviour under stress, about medical care, about motivating terrified animals to traverse terrain that violated every instinct. When those mahouts died, their knowledge died with them. Ancient sources mention that Hannibal recruited additional mahouts from Gallic tribes who had experience with large animals, training them hurriedly to supplement his overworked elephant handlers. Whether these improvised mahouts possessed skills comparable to professionals from India and Africa is doubtful. The loss of 36 of 37 elephants suggests that even professional knowledge proved insufficient for conditions no one had previously attempted. The memorial monuments erected in Rome after Hannibal's final defeat conspicuously avoided glorifying Roman commanders who had failed against him. Flaminius received no memorial despite dying fighting Hannibal at Trasimene. The slain consul Paulus from Cannae was remembered more for his death than achievements. Only Scipio Africanus received full honours because only he had definitively defeated Hannibal in open battle. This selective memory created a simplified narrative where Rome's triumph was inevitable, rather than desperately uncertain for over a decade. The elephants that had appeared in the Alps became footnotes, exotic details in a story whose outcome Roman ideology required to be predetermined. The actual physical remains of Hannibal's elephants, bones and tusks left in Italy, became relics collected by Romans. Ancient sources mention elephant bones displayed in temples, supposedly from Hannibal's army, though authentication was impossible. These relics served religious and political functions, physical evidence of Rome's triumph over impossible odds, tangible connections to Rome's greatest military trial. Whether any bones actually came from Hannibal's elephants, or were simply elephant remains attributed to them for propaganda purposes cannot be determined. The symbolic value exceeded any historical authenticity. The climate of the Alps in 218 BC, during the period when Hannibal crossed, represents another factor modern historians consider. The Mediterranean world was experiencing what paleoclimatologists call the Roman warm period, temperatures slightly higher than the medieval average, but with significant annual variations. October 218 BC could have been unusually mild, making the crossing less impossible than it would be in colder years, or unusually harsh, making Hannibal's achievement even more remarkable. Ice core data from alpine glaciers shows climate variability during this period, but cannot pinpoint specific months. The ancient sources emphasize snow and cold, suggesting conditions were harsh, but authors writing decades later may have exaggerated difficulties to enhance Hannibal's achievement and explain Roman surprise. The economic cost of Hannibal's Alpine crossing to Carthage itself rarely receives historical attention. The expedition required enormous capital investment. Each elephant represented years of training, experienced mahouts, specialized equipment. The army of 90,000 required weapons, armour, supplies, transport animals, all funded by Carthaginian state resources and Hannibal's personal wealth from Spanish silver mines. When 3/4 of the force died or deserted before reaching Italy, when 36 of 37 elephants were lost, the financial loss was staggering. Carthage never fully recovered economically. The gamble on Hannibal's strategic genius consumed resources the state couldn't afford to lose. Victory might have justified the cost. Defeat left Carthage permanently weakened. The silence of most Italian communities during Hannibal's presence in Italy, neither actively aiding him nor rebelling against Rome, demonstrates the complexity of ancient Italian politics. Many cities harboured resentments against Roman domination, but they also feared their neighbours and recognised that Hannibal could offer no permanent security. If he won and left, Rome would return and punish collaborators savagely. This calculated neutrality frustrated Hannibal's strategy, which required Italian allies to provide supplies and bases. Rome's confederation system, for all its exploitation and inequality, created sufficient shared interest that most members chose known Roman domination over uncertain Carthaginian liberation. The technological stagnation in elephant military usage that followed Hannibal's campaigns is historically significant. Unlike other military innovations that underwent continuous improvement, elephant warfare remained essentially unchanged from Alexander the Great to its eventual abandonment. No one developed better armour for elephants, more effective howdahs for mounted archers, or systematic breeding programs to create larger war elephants. This stagnation suggests that practical limitations outweighed theoretical benefits. Elephants looked impressive, provided psychological impact in first encounters, but offered insufficient tactical advantage to justify the enormous logistical burden. Hannibal's genius was recognizing that for his specific strategic situation, the psychological impact of elephants appearing impossibly in Italy outweighed the logistical cost of getting them there. The moment Rome realized nothing was impossible, transformed Western military thinking more profoundly than any single battle. The conceptual shift from believing in secure geographical barriers to understanding that any defense could be circumvented forced systematic thinking about defense in depth, strategic reserves, intelligence gathering, and preventive warfare. These concepts, forged in the terror of elephants appearing where they could not be, became foundational to Western military doctrine. 2,000 years later, military planners still study Hannibal's crossing not for tactics but for strategic audacity, for willingness to attempt the impossible in service of larger strategic objectives, for understanding that psychological impact can exceed material advantage.